All right, wonderful. I think this is a pretty different presentation than Sarah's. That was wonderful, but it's not so practical. It's much more conceptual, right? I think part of what I want to do today is talk about the narratives that we have around biochar and how they affect the growth of the industry. Ultimately, I'm trying to explain a question that I had about a year and a half ago, which is why isn't biochar already big, and how do we go about changing that? So my name is Peter Oliver. I run The Burning Question. And I mean, first of all, who am I? I'm a former entrepreneur. I've been a farmer, software product developer, writer. I'm coming at this with a concern basically around climate, right? So I'm thinking about how do we use biochar as a potential CDR method, so carbon dioxide removal method, and how does that fit into a more sustainable world, and how do we use it to blunt climate change? So then the goal of The Burning Question is to answer this question, right? Can you build a sophisticated, rapidly growing biochar sector to draw down carbon at scale? I'm kind of coming at this from an entrepreneurial background, and trying to answer the question of why has biochar not reached, say, the scale that we've seen in other kind of similar technologies that feel really applicable. And then, the thing that I've been doing with The Burning Question, which is, a newsletter and social media presence, YouTube, is interview people, companies, and researchers that are doing the kind of key research to turn the tide, I guess, and maybe build the market. So I'm going to kind of walk through my hypothesis here in 5 parts, and then kind of what to do about the future. So so the first part is around the story of biochar. And when I first came to it, you notice this inherent tension between what is being said about the field and some of the pieces of the field. So there's this, the field is just starting to grow. You hear a lot of people say that. And yet, as you all know, the technology, biochar itself, predates Homo sapiens, right? This is something that has been around probably quite a bit longer than we have been around. And so you have these historical reference points that you can point to. Terra Preta in Brazil. You have use of charcoal in agriculture from all over the Northeast, U.S. and parts of the New World. Feed amendment through maybe starting in the 1300s, but probably predating that in the U.S. and Europe. Soil amendments in places like Cambodia and in rice paddies in particular. And so you're set up for this expectation. And you see this really well captured in TEDx presentations from the last kind of spike of biochar interest, which you can see on YouTube there. But you end up with this feeling like, oh my gosh, how could I have been so blind? The solution is really obvious and such a big problem. And surely when I search for biochar, I'll end up with all these amazing companies scaling globally. And the truth is that when you do end up doing that search, as I did, you end up seeing a lot of small scale producers, a lot of DIY kits, abandoned websites, a ton of really great research, and what feels like a lot of breakthroughs, and then some sort of defensive tones, and then just a few regional distributors. And that kind of roller coaster that you go on, right? This like finding this incredible, apparently lost way of interacting with the world that looks like a real solution. You get your expectations up, and then you kind of find a fragmented industry, and you kind of go, I really wonder what happened here. Maybe it's not quite what I thought it could be. And that experience divides the field, right? Pretty quickly, even before people have really looked into it a lot, into believers and non-believers. So you have people who believers are kind of your typical person is like, look, written in ancient hand on the ground we walk on, right? Proof that we've gone down the wrong path. We need to go back and evaluate how we treat the soil and the land. We should not have done tractors and sprays. We should go the other way, right? And I think, maybe they're engineers and they think, wow, I could build a machine that makes biochar and we could save the world, right? Non-believers go, geez, seems like an expensive soil additive that people don't really understand. Maybe it works really well in some places, but no one can tell me how much it's going to affect my yield. Like, it's essentially impossible to get my hands on large quantities of it. This doesn't seem real. Like, I'm going to ignore this. This seems maybe maybe it is snake oil after all, right? And neither of those parties get to a place initially where I think what you have is people making up, forming one of those groups before they really make up their own mind. And because of that, because of the divisive nature of the story, you end up with companies that are, now you see a lot of companies not using the word biochar because they don't want to be part of that history, right? And so, but this doesn't really explain why that happened. So the second part of this is you have agricultural industrialization in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the US and much of Europe. And that spurs, along with maybe the Vietnam War and some cultural, countercultural kind of leadership, to back to the land movement. That's like a geodesic dome in Vermont, where I'm from. Although my parents are not in that picture, perhaps surprisingly. And I think the people that were the kind of leaders in this movement, Stuart Brand, James Lovelock, were really led the counterculture movement. And as they got older in the later part of their career in the 90s, they were very much on the leading edge of kind of understanding the impact of climate change. They took their ethos that was of that era, counterculture, anti-industrialization, DIY, right, self-sufficiency, and they went looking for a solution to climate change that might fit with their worldview, and they found biochar. So I think the paradox here is that the people that then supported biochar, right, these leaders, they work to prevent rather than foster the beginning of a sophisticated biochar industry. Well, how did that happen, right? I think the basic question is, if you have a DIY community ethos, is it better to make or to buy biochar? And what you see is kind of, instead of encouraging people to start biochar companies or buy biochar, they encourage people to be like them, right, and make biochar themselves. Now, you can see this manifested in the resources that you see to this day, right? If you search for biochar, you end up with tons of resources on feedstock and processes and equipment and co-composting and all these kinds of things. And ultimately, this idea resulted in a community where it's a small group of enthusiasts, right? And it's very much focused on making biochar, not using biochar. And I say it's hostile to entrepreneurs because of the ethos that surrounds that, you end up in a situation where every potential customer who would have bought biochar is now convinced that they should instead be making biochar, right? So it becomes difficult to make direct to customer businesses, right? But there's also this element of this which is tied up in the third point that I want to make, which is if the point is DIY, everyone should be making it, distributed production, right? There's an implied, I guess there's an implication that biochar is easy to make, and you hear this, right? You can make biochar in your backyard. A year of research leads me to believe, and not that I'm against backyard biochar, I think that's great. People should do it. I've done it, right? But it is holding the industry back because, as you'll see, basically my argument is that DIY production of biochar is actually worse for the planet, the consumer, and the producer than industrial biochar. And I think we need to kind of reorient towards industrial production, right? So I've been using the analogy of a hot dog, which is you can make hot dogs at home, of course, right? But realistically, hot dogs are an industrial product, and we should probably let people who are really good at making them, make them, right? And so, if you look at it from a biochar perspective, it's worse for the planet because making biochar at home is very, very unlikely. Most people do Kentucky kits or pit burns, things like that, that you use the heat, which is a key part of making kind of the climate math work for biochar production. The particulate matter emissions tend to be higher on a volume of biochar produced scale than industrial applications. And so if you look at the lifetime carbon accounting here, it makes way more sense to produce biochar in an industrial setting than at home. Obviously, there are caveats to all this, right? But I think that's generally true. It's also worse for the customer. It's harder to make exactly the same biochar yourself, right, than comparative to an industrial facility. And because you have slightly inconsistent feedstock, production methods, burn times, just the variance of making biochar, you end up having complications around post-processing, right? So putting the right stuff in with your biochar, perhaps it's complicated to match the biochar that you have to the soil needs. Testing that stuff can be difficult. And so you end up with a customer with a less reliable product or a less uniform product. And it's also worse for the producer in that it remains much more time intensive, and carbon offsets are difficult to impossible to attain on a small scale basis at this point. So I think, I think a lot of people take that as like, we shouldn't do it in our backyards at all. I think that it's fine if we do, but if what we're talking about is building the industry and building the market, we need to focus on industrial production. So part three, so the kind of what happens if we were to produce a lot in industrial production, I think we end up in a virtuous cycle, and this is essentially the argument here. So more industrial production means more sophisticated, predictable biochar. More sophisticated biochar, or better characterization of that biochar, allows you to build products on top of that biochar with predictable results, right? So you have better characterization. Then because you're building better products, you have better product market fit. You can build products that fit really well for fertilizer markets, for phosphorus or filtration markets, for soil media, for toxic cleanup, right? You need those pieces to fit really well for people to valorize the product. So better product fit means better economics, right? If you have a really good product market fit, you can increase your price. People are happy to pay it. That means that you have higher upside, right? Your economics are better. That means to someone else, you're lower risk. So if you have better economics and lower risk, your project finance costs come down, right? So you can go to a bank and you're saying, I'm actually making money here. I would love to take out a loan to build a bigger factory, right? So if you can get project finance, you can drive down the cost of production because you can do larger scale. And if you can get down, move the cost of production down, you can increase your market size. So this is kind of like what I see across the industry. I think a lot of people a lot of the industry is currently stuck in this spot where it's not scaled up enough to be really sophisticated and predictable and available at large enough quantity because they haven't gone through this kind of product market fit cycle. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So there's the two last pieces here are around kind of why we haven't seen seek to explain why we haven't seen like a this is what biochar is for kind of thing. And I think that the reason is that I think of the people that I've talked to, most of the founders and the companies weren't focused specifically on solving a client's problems. They're focused primarily on solving the problem of, in some cases, about half of the people are kind of looking at it from a climate or a soil perspective and saying, hey, we've really got to do something about this problem. What can I do, right? Another, say 25% are focused on waste management, right? So they've got a big pile of waste biomass. How do I reduce my cost, right? Or increase my value marginally? As you can imagine, the people in the first category also overlap with the kind of believer's mindset that I laid out. And what you end up with, people that are trying to solve that problem end up going, how can I save the world? Okay, I need to make more biochar because that will draw down more carbon. So then the question they're solving for is kind of, how can I make the most amount of biochar? And as you can imagine, even if they succeed, the issue very quickly becomes, how do I sell it, right? And if they're focusing their energy on how do I make a lot, and assuming that people will buy the product, it tends not to work out, right? So having product-focused entrepreneurs is where I think the market is going to change. The waste management group mirrors this, right? They want to get rid of their product. If they're willing to, if biochar saves them 2%, they do it. If it doesn't, they don't. But they're not trying to develop the market long term. You're starting to see some people kind of break that trend, specifically around biosolids. But these are kind of like, I'm not trying to provide explanations that work for every case, but kind of like describe how we might have gotten here, right? However, the biochar's killer app, I think, is coming, right? You're starting to see, I would say 25% of the people I talk to are what I would consider to be next-gen entrepreneurs. They're specifically asking, what does my customer want? They're doing, repeatable, rigorous biochar production, and they're not really talking about biochar. And in some sense, like, I think a red flag to me in a product focused company is if you have to sell the concept of biochar, if you have to say biochar, if people have to understand the story of Terra Preta to buy your product, then it's going to be really hard because you're going to have to educate every single one of the people that you talk to. And so you're starting to see these next gen entrepreneurs not really talking about this, right? They're talking about the value to the customer. And interestingly, while these next gen entrepreneurs, I think, may be the first people to kind of succeed in a product orientation, the carbon market is kind of coming back for everyone that was building companies before. In some sense, they were kind of saying, hey, this is a part of the market. The biochar is good, right? Because it does all this good stuff, but it's not being valorized. And in some sense, the carbon market is kind of coming back to provide that to them. And so we may see, I think we'll see, two things happen. But what we're seeing now is a lot of early founders are transitioning to operators that are focused on product, right? So you see this with companies that are going kind of like, okay, we made a machine. Okay, we're making biochar. Oh, okay, we have to solve this problem. Carboculture comes to mind, right? They build this really cool, novel machine, and then they have taken it and now they're focused on helping cities plant trees, right? Okay, excellent. And so I guess like I think the one thing that I took away from this was that if the kind of save the worlders can, and even the waste disposal market can kind of hang on long enough, they'll end up being right because they'll get paid out for carbon credits. And maybe the view of this is not that they're wrong, but perhaps that they were just early. And then the last thing I want to bring up is the idea of Terrapreta. And I think there's the idea that, oh, well, what is biochar's killer app? Well, it's in soil. And I think the truth is more complicated than that. And I think the finding of Terrapreta actually sent the field down kind of like a long detour, in which basically the goal of creating Terrapreta, while very exciting, and I think we'll probably do it in the next 10 years, for the last 30 years, we really haven't been able to do that. And we haven't been able to do it either because it's too complicated technically, or it's too expensive. But that created the image in the market of, oh, we're going to be able to create Terrapreta. And then when the biochar market couldn't deliver that, there's some sense of like, oh, okay, well, I guess I don't know what this is then. And I think, like, why is it a red herring? Well, the way I see it is it's the highest complexity, lowest value application of biochar, in that the people that we want to do this for, right, farmers, are risk averse and cash poor, so they can't pay much per ton. And then the complexity is extreme. You're dealing with feedstock, soil microbiome, all the different types of pyrolysis, transportation, yields. This is just this hyper complex environment, and it's not that valuable. So while I think that soil amendments and the goal of making Terrapreta can still be the sector's North Star, I think we really have to focus in the short term on developing some of these kind of easier to crack nuts, things that might drive higher value. All right, so then why isn't biochar big? This is the kind of thesis statement, right? potential of biochar is yet to be realized because it's a new thing with none of the novelty, an old thing without developed markets or policy support, and a complex thing we've been telling people is simple. And we've been focused on the wrong initial customer, and we've also told them not to buy it. So you kind of take that, all that stuff is coming from, just kind of the narrative that comes out of the field. Now, I don't actually think that this is like some sort of indictment. I consider this to be a blameless process. Everyone was doing this kind of what they thought was the best at the time according to their values. And so how do we get from here to scale? Well, there are two paths to growth, and they mirror these two different styles of getting to market that I think it's worth going through in brief. One, Tesla, which is about pushing down marginal cost over time, and tech or software, which are about scaling at any cost and then selling something that you might not think to be your product, right? So in brief, because I know I only have a minute here, Tesla started with a exceedingly expensive car and sold that with the explicit intention of driving down their production cost as they sold them, knowing that a very expensive car would provide them the margin to invest in the people, facilities, et cetera, to continue to grow their business. And as you can see, they've worked down the cost curve from their initial Roadster now to the Model 3. And in doing so, they've brought the volume up. That's kind of what an MVP or a minimum viable product concept is about. And I think it's worth thinking about how in the biochar industry, we could focus on things that are maybe lower complexity, higher value applications that are lower volume, and using the margins that are developed in that industry to build out the scale that we all want. So things that come to mind are activated carbon, PFAS capture, phosphorus capture products, toxic remediation, battery tech if we can get there in time, although I know that that's still pretty early stage tech, biogenic carbon black, soil medias, microbiome, kind of ways to manipulate the microbiome. So that's all about kind of starting at the top end of the market and working your way down as you decrease your marginal cost. The other way is tech, right? Is basically you don't sell your product, you give your product away, you scale up, as scale is really the only thing that matters at all, and you minimize the cost of production in the absolute. So you want your marginal cost to effectively be zero, and the quality of the product matters less than the quantity, right? So that kind of seems unappealing, right? But you can see where this overlaps, right? Everyone's been thinking about, well, how do we valorize the biochar itself? The advent of voluntary carbon markets and the real uptake in the last 6 months means that we may be in the position where what matters is how much biochar you can make, not who can use it after you make it. So I think we'll start seeing some more products like this. But I think this provides kind of a divergent way of getting to scale. And yeah, so I don't have a ton more time here, but as you can tell, it's best fit for waste management, agricultural applications, sequester, and construction. But yeah, thank you. You can find me on Twitter, YouTube. You can sign up for my newsletter, or you can send me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a different presentation than we are used to, but a really interesting view on the whole biochar industry. So we got some questions, and I tried to condense them probably. So the first question was, what do you think about why don't we have policy support, or why are governments not jumping on this product so far?
Yeah, I think what you see in policy support is that unless it has broad-based support, it follows the market. It tends not to lead. So you may see policy support kind of move here around carbon, but there's not enough people that know and care about biochar to support biochar as a policy initiative as of right now. So you don't see really amazing policy pushing the biochar market forward, abstracted from the carbon markets. I do think you'll see more regulation there that promotes the market. Like in Europe, I think they'll probably ban soil media like rock wool and peat that have negative carbon. externalities, which will enormously, increase the demand for biochar-based soil media.
And then there was another big question about is making biochar in your backyard really hurting the industry, or isn't it that the potential customers don't see this the benefits against the value of against the cost of the biochar? Because I mean, obviously it's a long-term thing in contrast to a short-term cost.
Yeah, I think again, it's about viewing it from the point of the growth of the industry. So I don't think it's necessarily like hurting anyone, but if you think about if we had instead of told people, hey, you can make this yourself, right? If every single one of those people had been told, go buy it from your local biochar maker, right? There would be a much more sophisticated market, and there would be much more volume produced and more time, investment, energy put into the business models that fit around that. So I think if you take the enthusiasm for biochar and you focus it on kind of capitalism, and again, I don't know exactly how I feel about this. I think if we had 200 years to adjust to the to climate change, I would feel less intense about this. But I do feel like, hey, we do have to grow this market fast. How do we grow it fast as opposed to doing it in a way that is more maybe aligned with my like inherent principles, which are like self-reliant. I would love to everyone to DIY. That's great. But how do we get it to scale? Well, we need people to buy stuff and push those markets up.
And then there was another topic from okay, there's no name on that. So in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of crop waste burning, and I think the question is, I mean, that's a different market, I think, in Southeast Asia, because you're not so much focused on products, or it's more the waste management part. And the person argues that in this case, do-it-yourself biochar might actually be more beneficial than industrialized biochar.
Yeah, I would say making biochar is probably better than not making biochar, but making biochar in an industrial setting is better than making it in a non-industrial setting. So I think, what you're seeing with Kevin Kung's company, which is called Takachar, and also Husk, is you see kind of regionally distributed models that make a ton of sense for developing world, and also are capable of capturing some of the value that is derived in the heat, which is just, from a carbon accounting perspective, really matters a lot. It obviously doesn't change the soil portion of this, and there's obviously a lot of there's meaningful conversation to be had whether soil or the carbon capture itself is the more valuable part of it. But if you're looking at it from a strict LCA, like lifetime carbon accounting viewpoint, you definitely want to use the heat. So, I mean, yeah, if you're gonna burn it or make biochar at home, like definitely make biochar. But if you're going to burn it at home or take it to someone who can make biochar and whose yields are going to be 35% instead of 25%, or things like that, those are things that I would say are worth doing.
And then Thomas asked, what do you think the killer application will be? What is your best guess of the big breakthrough application?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on it's all like with all biomass, it's all like, well, what's your localized problem? I think you'll see the stuff that I listed around the product. Things are like soil media, I think, will probably be a big one. So, a carbon negative growing media, particularly for controlled growing environments like cannabis, things like that, where you have this like bloom of indoor controlled grow operations, and they're looking for ways to both differentiate and be carbon negative. So I think that will be a market that pops. I think phosphorus capture will be another one. Phosphorus is really valuable. It's not complicated to capture at least some of the phosphorus coming off of waste streams with biochar. And I think, I think this is, I think there are a bunch of different applications. PFAS, there's a company called Bigen in Australia, which is creating activated charcoal for PFAS capture, which is a toxin. and those are the kind of high value things. But I mean, if we see the carbon markets, say, okay, open game on field application for biochar, that could still end up being the killer app. I think, that's what people are kind of betting. And I really wish, we had spent the last 30 years building companies where people make a lot of money and drive cars that say like biochar vanity license plates and all that kind of stuff, so that we have the infrastructure to get to scale now. But hopefully that will happen now with the carbon markets as they are.
We also got some comments about another big markets about the construction industry, which saw some pilot projects lately, and also water filtration, because the market is just huge.
Yeah.
My last question would be, because we saw that 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, that there was a lot of interest from governments to fund biochar projects, and a lot of companies popped up, and most of them died after 5 to 7 years because they over promised and didn't supply what they said they would do. What's your opinion of how we can avoid the same issue again? Because we know it's kind of a complex material, and when people talk about biochar, they talk about something like one material, but instead it's a class of thousands of different.
Yeah, I forget who told me this analogy, but I think the best analogy for thinking about biochar is plastic. Like, it's made of plastic, and you're like, well, it's like, it could be just about anything, right? And you look at biochar, and I'm like, maybe it's not quite as diverse as plastic, but maybe it is. And it would be better if people thought about it as that kind of category as opposed to a single product. And so I think, and that's why I think, like, these boom bust cycles are basically based on people not having super strong value propositions to a specific customer, right? Because that's what allows you to survive. And I think, looking at it from an outsider's perspective, from an entrepreneurial perspective, like, what I want to see is really high margins, right? I'm like, okay, like, I want to know that you guys can make it, so go make money, and that is how you will survive. And I think there's this like tension there, because a lot of people in the industry are into biochar for the right reasons, which are like making the planet better and soil and improving the world. And so being like, you got to make as much money as you possibly can doesn't sound like good advice or relevant like feedback. But I do actually think, in order to get to scale where we can focus on all the amazing stuff that biochar can do for the world, I do really think that we need to like actually get to a place. There's you can't save someone else if you can't save yourself kind of thing that's going on in the industry. And I think that's starting to change now, right? Well, especially in the last 8 months. But yeah, that's well, in any case, it's been really fun to chat with you guys. This has been a really fun time. And sign up for my newsletter if you like the kind of stuff that I'm writing here. And I'm always looking for interesting companies to chat with. So feel free to reach out.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Very interesting presentation. And to all the others, so Peter, if you want to, you still have some questions in the chat. So I leave the meeting on in case you want to answer, or otherwise you will find the presentation online from Peter, the recording from it, and there's also the email address from him.
Yep, and I will post the presentation on LinkedIn or wherever you post it afterwards. I'm happy to share this information.